Before we tour the actual front, we need to finish our conversation about the home front in World War One. Now, the story of the home front in World War One leads to two other significant stories. One of those stories is the modern day civil rights movement. The other story is, of course, the enactment of the 19th Amendment, basically the amendment that gives women the right to vote. Now, the thing is that war is hell, but for some it's more hellish than others. One of the ironies in American history is that for marginalized groups, war has, in some respects, offered them opportunities that they would not otherwise have. Because, of course, a total war means the mobilization of everything and everybody, including those people who usually are ignored or discriminated against. And of course, the two large groups that we're talking about, that'll be especially relevant for this particular war, is African Americans and women. Now, the thing is that if you're mobilizing over 5 million troops and sending them overseas out of a total population of about 100 million people, that's a sizable chunk of your overall workforce. And you have to figure out a way to not only fill gaps, but also expand wartime production. Now, we need more industrial labor. The problem is that for African Americans were disproportionately located in the American South. The Civil War, Reconstruction, the consequences of Jim Crow, that did not alter the basic fact that the vast majority of African Americans from 1619 with the establishment of slavery in Jamestown until the early 20th century were located disproportionately in the South. World War One changes that. World War One changes that because the demand for industrial jobs triggers this massive migration of African Americans to northern and midwestern states. Over 6 million African Americans migrate during the Great Migration. And let me skip forward just for a second so you can kind of see the geographic extent of what we're talking about. In the main, they're immigrating to the West Coast, places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, but especially areas like just New England in general, Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit. And one of the unexpected consequences is that NAACP membership doubles in about 2 years. Remember that the NAACP has been around for a couple of decades by this point, and the NAACP wasn't really established primarily to fight against Jim Crow and racial segregation. I mean, that was kind of a pipe dream at that point. Really, what the NAACP was primarily concerned with is campaigning against lynchings, basically where African Americans would be killed out of hand, and more or less the law enforcement, tended to look the other way. The First World War and lynching in the South to a certain extent um, triggers this influx of African Americans throughout the rest of the United States. And if you just look at the pattern changing here, in 1910, it looks like about 89% of African Americans lived in some way, shape, or form in the South. By 1970, that number goes down to about 53%. So it's a pretty astonishing transition. Now, the other thing that happens, though, is that this this migration of African Americans into the North also triggers a backlash. I mentioned a little while ago, actually, when we were talking about the mobilization of hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan, that in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan would basically emerge again. And remember, it doesn't so much reemerge in the South as much as in the Midwest. Places like Indiana or Michigan, states that were on the receiving end of this of the Great Migration, states that were attractive for African Americans. And I think I mentioned that Malcolm X's father is actually lynched in Lansing, Michigan. And this sort of reflects the fact that even though African Americans are fleeing or migrating to northern states, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily welcome with open arms. And one of the things we kind of see is that as African Americans move north, lynchings follow in their wake. And in 1919, millions of African American GI servicemen will return home from the war. And through a combination of sort of anti-black racism, fears of communism and socialism, there is this backlash against African Americans in this really scary event called the Red Summer. In the Red Summer, over 1,000 lynchings take place across the country. Many of them are in the South, but they're also in places like San Francisco, kind of seen as like the progressive capital of the United States, New London, Connecticut. And that just kind of shows you that just because African Americans are moving away from the Jim Crow South, Jim Crow and racial segregation isn't just confined to the South, but also just hatred, lynchings against African Americans. That also is not just confined to the South. It spreads and moves north along with them. Part of what mobilizes the Red Summer is that as African Americans return home from Europe, they're returning home with a few common experiences. One of those experiences is that when they're in France or the UK or just Europe in general, they're not treated horrible. And for many African Americans, this was kind of an earth-shattering revelation. W.E.B. Du Bois, who you might remember from your progressive sources assignment, whatever it is I called it. W.E.B. Du Bois was a Harvard educated sociologist. He actually was the first African American to earn a doctorate degree in the United States. And this was actually before doctoral degrees were very common. Again, you had to be incredibly wealthy and incredibly bright to get a doctoral degree in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And really before that time period, they really didn't exist. What Du Bois found is that he, even though he was extremely well educated, he still experienced widespread discrimination, not just in the South, but in the North as well. Then he studies abroad in Germany, and he finds that the Germans, believe it or not, treat him with respect. He actually gets a few German girlfriends. Now, that being said, you probably are familiar with the fact that Germany has its own racial and ethnic hangups, to put it mildly. So, but there is this kind of, let's say, blind spot for African Americans in German society. Jews were and would be discriminated against, but African Americans could, basically live, let's say, better lives than they could in the United States. So this was eye-opening for Du Bois. And what's happening in World War I is that millions of African Americans are having that exact same experience, where they realize life doesn't have to be horrible. And that's really sad that we should even have to explain that this is a revelation. But the thing is that if you don't know that life can get any better, you're not going to pursue that better life. But because of the Great Migration, because African Americans are more essential to the economy, and the thing is that because they're moving into cities, into communities like Harlem, it means that they can get together to politically mobilize. The NAACP as an organization actually doubles its membership just in a couple of years, between I think 1916 to 1918. So this kind of lays the groundwork, by the way, for what happens in the 1950s and the 1960s, where African Americans are able to organize to a certain extent. Anyway, when African Americans return home, what happens is they mobilize for um, rights in general, political rights. They also are sort of organizing at the same time that labor unions are organizing. And it has to be remembered that the Soviet Union it hasn't been created just yet, but Russia is at least in control of by the Bolsheviks, the communists, and Woodrow Wilson and many other politicians believe that African Americans aren't just protesting or demonstrating for civil rights. And by the way, people like Wilson believe that would be bad enough. But Wilson also believes that these demonstrations that occur in 1919 are sympathetic or supportive of communism. And we'll touch upon that a little bit more. But one of the things that happens in the 1920s is there's this event called the Red Scare. Not to be confused with the Red Scare that sort of occurs in the 1950s with McCarthyism. This was kind of the pre-McCarthy Red Scare that occurs. And to a certain extent, fears of communism and fears of African Americans, they kind of become intertwined, and the result is really toxic and, just to be honest, pretty scary. Now, the story of how women get the right to vote, though, actually begins with the story of another form of mass hysteria, and that is the anti German hysteria that grips the nation during the First World War. And that in itself is pretty remarkable when you think about it. Germans have been immigrating to the United States for, at this point, over 200 years. But now Germans are seen as potentially treasonous to a certain extent. Many Germans were conscientious objectors, meaning they're pacifists. And the thing is that many Germans have had historical connections with pacifist religious sects dating back to the 16 and 1700s, the Seventh-day Adventists, for example, Quaker churches, so on. Many of these Germans were just, sort of philosophically pacifist. And remember that the Germans themselves actually, or the ones who immigrated in the 19th century, they tended to be political opponents of the German Empire. But again, that did not necessarily mean that they were enthusiastic about the prospect of taking up arms against their sort of country of origin. Now, the thing is that you see this need to kind of purge or scrub clean German references, including things like, for example, calling hamburgers the Liberty Sandwich, cabbage, or sorry, sauerkraut, Liberty cabbage, and of course, the thing is that in many cases, you actually have Germans who are interned into camps. We'll talk about this on a much larger scale in the Second World War and how we treat Japanese Americans. But some Germans were actually lynched. About 6,300 were arrested, and 250,000, 250,000, were actually forced to register. And we're not sure exactly how many, but at the very least, 2,000 Germans were put in internment camps. So basically, everything you hear about, um, basically the experiences of German Americans in the First World War. Just remember what happens to them and apply that on a larger scale to what happens to Japanese Americans in the Second World War. Now, the thing is that this pushback against German Americans is kind of a part of a broader effort to clamp down on wartime protests. Now, the government passes what is called the Espionage and Sedition Act. In addition to maybe to making you feel a little bit uneasy, you should also get a sense of deja vu if you remember the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the thing is that the Espionage and Sedition Act is very similar to the Alien and Sedition Act from John Adams's administration. And the thing is that both acts try to regulate political speech in wartime. Now, the thing is, remember, the Alien and Sedition Acts was passed at a time when you didn't have a Supreme Court with judicial review. So even though it was arguably unconstitutional, it violated the First Amendment, it's never struck down in court. Now, we talked about the fact that with the passage of the 14th Amendment, suddenly you have cases across the country that are trying to deal with what freedom of speech actually means. What does freedom of religion actually mean? Because suddenly the Bill of Rights becomes much more relevant. So what happens is that it's not just Germans who were arrested. You also have people who were arrested more or less for opposing the war because they were seen as potentially treasonous. It also has to be mentioned that there was basically a terrorist attack launched in New York City by a German spy by the name of Franz von Papen. It wasn't very effective, but it scared a lot of people. It's kind of a similar climate to what happened on September 11th, right? Nobody knew what was going to happen next, and this was kind of one of the, let's say, one of the it was a rationale for the Espionage and Sedition Act itself. So Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate who is always running for president, he's arrested along with 2,000 other Americans. So what happens is that I think I mentioned the Schenck case a while back. So Charles Schenck is a socialist like Eugene V. Debs, and socialists around this time period tended to argue that World War I was a war for empire, a war for the European powers to expand their empires. And you'll actually see why you could kind of make a case for that to a certain extent. Well, anyway, Schenck argues that the draft constitutes involuntary servitude, and that involuntary servitude is unconstitutional under the 13th Amendment. Now, Schenck apparently distributes something like 15,000 pamphlets or leaflets containing this argument. And the implication is that people who were drafted under the Selective Service Act did not have to serve. So Schenck is arrested. what happens is, of course, Schenk's lawyers argue that this is freedom of speech and it's political speech. He's making a political argument under the plain language of the 13th Amendment. And so, therefore, Schenk's conviction, should be overturned and he should be released. This goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what happens is that Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a progressive author back in the day, he actually wrote a very influential work called The Common Law. And one of the things that Holmes kind of argued to a certain extent is that the law should be reinterpreted so that the law could get a socially desirable outcome. Now, for Holmes, though, the socially desirable outcome is that the draft should proceed as planned. It's, again, another example of how the war divided many progressives, and usually in one of two sort of extreme camps. Some progressives thought that the war was absolutely evil. Other progressives saw that fighting the German Kaiser, fighting against unrestricted submarine warfare, that this is really the definition of what it meant to be a progressive. You're fighting for, broader, liberally minded ideas. But anyway, Holmes basically argues that in the Supreme Court opinion, that declaring the draft illegal, or at least Schenck arguing that the draft is illegal, is the equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater. And by the way, that's where that expression comes from. So, in other words, it is political speech, but it's political speech that could immediately produce harm. Now, what happens is that there's another case that is tried under the Espionage and Sedition Act. And this case is the Abrams versus United States case. Abrams is a Russian Jewish refugee. And Abrams publishes an anti-war pamphlet that doesn't so much criticize the United States as much as criticize America's ally, the Russian Empire, during this time period. Abrams is arrested. His case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And I would love to tell you that Abrams's conviction is overturned, but of course that's not what happens. But what is interesting, though, is that Justice Holmes pivots. Remember that he upholds the Schenck conviction, arguing that criticizing the draft is actually dangerous. And because it's so dangerous, that the benefit of having a political debate on the nature of conscription is exceeded by just how dangerous that type of speech is. But in the Abrams case, Holmes argues that the Supreme Court is kind of going a little too far here. And in this opinion, he actually argues for an approach that we still have today to a certain extent on how to view the First Amendment. And by the way, it's an incredibly capitalist notion. As you could probably tell from the title, The Marketplace of Ideas. What Holmes is really arguing is that when we're talking about speech or freedom of speech, we're not really talking about speech. Instead, we're talking about ideas. And speech is just simply the way we convey ideas. And so, what's insidious about regulating speech isn't the fact that we're regulating speech, because the thing is that the First Amendment applies to writing. Theoretically, it could apply to Morse code or semaphore or text messages. What it is that we're afraid of is that the government is stepping in and regulating ideas. And Holmes argues that not only is that morally questionable, but the thing is that just like when markets are regulated, there are certain inefficiencies that are created. Because obviously, one of the arguments in favor of capitalism is that you should let the invisible hand of the market regulate prices, and it's going to do a much better job of regulating prices than the government could. Just like if you want the best products for the best price, if you want the best ideas, you should trust the American people to buy those ideas, to adopt those ideas. And so by creating a marketplace for ideas, you allow ideas to come in and be debated, to be cross examined. And to be honest, even today, we still argue about this approach. Whenever somebody comes in and says something that we would broadly consider to be hate speech, for example, we have that same debate. Do we allow hate speech? Because to be honest, if you look at the First Amendment today, there aren't very many restrictions on what can or can't be said. I mean, in schools, there are some broad restrictions. For safety, there are some restrictions. You can kind of regulate where that speech happens. But other than that, you really can't regulate the content, even if it's socially abhorrent or morally abhorrent. So the question is, and this is something that every generation will have to kind of wrestle with, is do you allow bad ideas, bad speech to exist, to be published, to be discussed, in order for those ideas to be called out and rebutted in this marketplace? Or by allowing those ideas to be discussed at all, do you allow concepts like racism or fascism or flat earthism, whatever you want to call it, do you allow that to take root? And again, it's something that emerges in the First World War, but almost every generation has a similar sort of debate over some issue. By the way, in the Vietnam War, the draft gets revisited again in another Supreme Court case with sort of eerily similar fact patterns. Now, I told you that as part of this story, we have the story of women's suffrage. But to complicate matters further, one of the things that can be kind of confusing is the revelation that the 19th Amendment and the 18th Amendment are tied together. In other words, women's suffrage and the prohibition on alcohol are kind of linked together. Now, you being the brilliant scholars of American history that you are, you know that this is actually nothing new. That many of the campaigners against alcohol consumption, many of the campaigners in favor of temperance were historically women. And in fact, it was a movement mostly led by women as kind of part of this notion of the cult of domesticity, that women were sort of adopting the role of being nurturers during the 19th century. Well, because World War I is a total war and you have to mobilize everything and everybody, the question is can you mobilize somebody who's nursing a hangover, who's basically schnockered out? And the thing is that temperance and the pushback against Germans and immigrants and women's suffrage is all kind of tied together. Because suddenly, if you think about the organizations that would stand to lose from prohibition, it's organizations like Budweiser, Heineken, Muller Lite, Anheuser-Busch. detect a pattern here, by the way? Not only was alcohol consumption seen as inefficient for the war effort, by the way, Tsar Nicholas II had banned vodka consumption in Russia in 1917. That didn't really work out well for Tsar Nicholas II, but you do see efforts by many governments in wartime to curtail alcohol consumption. But in the United States, alcohol consumption is stereotypically associated with immigrant groups. The Germans for basically being sort of forming these sort of big brewing conglomerations, and to a certain extent, the Irish as well. Now, the thing is that because of that association, the 18th Amendment is passed in 1917. Now, it takes a while for it to be ratified completely. It's actually ratified after the war is actually over in 1919. But to a certain extent, women are at the forefront of getting prohibition passed. And this is because women, if you remember the Charlotte Perkins book, Women in Economics, one of the things that Women in Economics argues is the fact that as women go into the workforce, that will give them political power. And to some extent, this is an old relationship. Women were seen as essential for the war effort in the Revolutionary War, in the Civil War, and they saw expanded rights and privileges. Well, now in World War I, there are over 8 million women in industrial jobs. And the fact that women have this newfound political power presents kind of a problem for the feminist movement as a whole. The suffragettes, like many other progressive groups, tended to sort of fall in one of two extremes. Many, like Jane Addams, the progressive feminist who helped organize Hull House, this kind of halfway house for immigrants in Chicago. Jane Addams opposed the war, and many feminists also opposed the war, believing that supporting war was antithetical to their principles. But Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the director of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, she saw the war as an opportunity. And so, as the war kind of expands in 1918, she makes a calculated argument to advance women's suffrage. She directs NAWSA to basically engage in hunger strikes and protest outside of Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill, and state capitals. And what Carrie Chapman Catt argues is, well, I'll read you her words, and you can kind of decide for yourself. Quote, "Every slacker has a vote. Every newly made citizen will have a vote. Every pro-German will have a vote. It is a risk, a danger to a country like ours to send 1 million men out of the country who are loyal and not replace those men by the loyal votes of women they have left at home." Now, the thing is that this argument works. What Catt argues is that the loyal Americans are fighting the Germans. And in 1918, there are midterm elections. In 1920, there's a presidential election. So the question is, who's left behind to vote? Well, the answer to Catt is the pro-Germans, the conscientious objectors, the people like Charles Schenck, who are arguing that the draft is akin or equivalent to slavery. It's those people who are left behind to vote. So give women the right to vote. So That way, the traitors, the slackers, as she puts it, sounds like, oh gosh, it sounds like Ferris Bueller's Day Off or something. Um, but that giving women the right to vote will basically um, mitigate the impact of the anti-war vote. Now, it's this argument, though, that actually works. In January of 1918, Congress passes a suffrage amendment. The 19th Amendment is ratified in August of 1920. Now, this is kind of a more depressing moment to a certain extent because, on the one hand, the 19th Amendment is passed, and that is truly a historic moment in U.S. history. You can't take away the gains made by the 19th Amendment. And just like we had to contextualize the 13th Amendment, the fact is that both amendments number 13 and 19 are examples of incredible advances. But we have to give some context. The reason the 19th Amendment passes is because of contexts that were peculiar to the First World War. And that context includes fears of immigrants, fears of Germans, fears of socialism and the anti-war movement as a whole, and also very cannily and in a very calculated way politicizes those fears in order to get the 19th Amendment passed. It's at this point that some of you are feeling a little, oh, I don't know, a little bit depressed, I guess, because this part of U.S. history is not very well known, or at least the full context isn't very well known. But we have to remember that the suffragette movement tried the, let's say, the more principled argument in the 19th century. Because remember, the suffragette movement decided to set aside questions of voting rights, questions of equal rights, so they could support the abolitionist movement. And remember, they tried to argue that women should be included in the 15th Amendment way back when. And you know what? That argument didn't work. So because that argument didn't work, they had to basically use an opportunity like this to pass the 19th Amendment. I should also mention that there is an assumption that women will vote for the Democratic Party because the 19th Amendment is passed by Democrats, mostly, by a Democratic administration. This assumption turns into hubris, or I guess a Greek tragedy, because what happens is that in 1920, the first presidential election where women can participate across the country, women overwhelmingly pick Warren G. Harding, a Republican, instead of the Democratic candidate. Now, that being said, speaking of politics, in 1917, the provisional government of Russia starts to crumble. The provisional government, if you remember, had one job, and that job was to make a peace with Germany. And then the provisional government just decided that it was going to continue on with the war, business as usual. And the Russians suffered defeat after defeat. Eventually, the revolutionaries get revolted against because the Germans decide to send home perennial troublemaker and communist ideologue Vladimir Lenin to Russia. And they send him to Russia knowing that he's going to start a ruckus. So what happens is that when Lenin, pictured here on the right, arrives in St. Petersburg, he helps spearhead a revolution, which sort of rises up in October of 1917 and topples the provisional government from power. Now, eventually, the Soviet Union will officially form in 1922. Now, the Soviet Union, or sorry, I should say Russia, at least at this point, because the Soviet Union hasn't quite been formed yet. But at the very least, you have to hand it to Lenin. He learned that if you promise to end the war, you should probably go ahead and do that. And so Lenin actually opens negotiations with the Germans, and they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. Now, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk actually gives up a ton of Russian territory. A lot of Eastern Europe today was actually owned by Russia during this time period, including about half of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Bulgaria, Ukraine. If your eyes have crossed yet, just accept the idea or accept the point that Russia is pretty big today, but it's even bigger in World War I. Now, the thing is, though, that all of that territory, or at least most of that territory, a territory that took hundreds of years for Russians to conquer, is given up and made independent in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, the thing is that Marx believed, Marx, of course, being the kind of the father of communism, Marx believed that the revolution of the working class, of the proletariat, was inevitable. And eventually, the proletariat would rise up and launch this worldwide communist revolution. So, in Lenin's mind, he's giving up land today, but it doesn't really matter. Because in his mind, communists almost have like Judgment Day. And that Judgment Day is the worldwide communist revolution. And in Lenin's mind, Judgment Day is at hand. One thing, though, that maybe Lenin foresaw was the fact that before the worldwide communist revolution had a chance to really begin, there's a civil war that breaks out in Russia, basically where the forces loyal to the monarchy, called the Whites, fight with the new communist regime, the Reds. Now, something that we don't necessarily appreciate in the United States is that this Russian Civil War wasn't just a civil war between the Whites and the Reds, because as the First World War ended, the United States and other European countries actually intervened in this Russian Civil War. The United States sends thousands of combat troops to Russia. They don't really end up doing much, but the fact that thousands of American troops are supporting the Whites, and by the way, we back the slow horse because the Whites lose, makes the communists paranoid of both the United States and Western Europe in general. And of course, we would have to wait until the Second World War to see the full impact of this decision. But if we're trying to explain the foundation for the Cold War, this is not a bad place to start, because with the emergence of Lenin and the Bolsheviks in Russia, relations between them and the United States government, let's say they don't start off on a good note. The end of Russian cooperation, though, poses more problems for the United States, because Russia ends its involvement in 1918, right as American combat troops are arriving in Europe. So the thing is that when the United States shows up on the Western Front, it, to a certain extent, is the worst time imaginable, because Russia surrenders, like I said, which means that for Germany, a two-front war has become virtually a one-front war. And be nice about French jokes. The French army in 1917 actually mutinies. There's this event called the Nivelle Mutiny, in which the French army just goes on strike. It pledges to defend the sacred soil of France from German invasion, but it's not going to go on any more offensives because, they don't appreciate being machine gunned. And to be honest, who does? But at the same time, if the war is going to end, they have to take territory. They have to push the German army out of France. And this kind of signifies that morale of the Western Allies, especially the French, is beginning to waver right as the Russians are knocked out. And the thing is that the U.S. Army is untrained, and now millions of German troops are moving from the Eastern Front to the West. The United States is going up against the best trained, most experienced army in the world, the German army. And as it's moving troops from the east to the west, for the first time since the war began, the Germans actually have numerical superiority on the Western Front. And by God, they intend to use it. So what happens is that the American Expeditionary Force is sent to Europe in 1917, led by this guy with the really sharp chin, John Blackjack Pershing. And as the American Expeditionary Force starts to mobilize, the Germans make one last-ditch push to try to win the war. Just in general. They try to take Paris again. And once again, they come within just a dozen kilometers of the city. They fight the Second Battle of the Marne, and it's at that point where the German advance is stopped cold. And what's interesting is that unlike the First Battle of the Marne, where the German army basically just retreats and entrenches, in the Second Battle of the Marne, and after Germany's last big push kind of peters out, instead of the German army sort of retreating in good order, what happens is that the German army starts to kind of crumble. And it crumbles for a variety of factors. The first is the development of new military tactics. The Western Allies, especially the British, it has to be said, began experimenting with coordinating tanks and artillery and aircraft. And apparently, if you organize them well and have them work as a team, then that combination allows you to break the stalemate of trench warfare. By the way, after the war is over, the Western Allies kind of forget about this solution because they're trying to mobilize and sort of return back to normal. But the Germans actually observe what the Western Allies are doing at the end of World War I, and let's just say they are super impressed and they take very good notes about what works and what doesn't. And in World War II, it's the Germans who become masters of, this new type of warfare that employs tanks and artillery and air power and infantry, all working in close coordination with one another. But the other thing, and probably the more important short-term reason for why Germany collapses, is not because of what happens necessarily on the battlefield, but at sea. More specifically, what doesn't happen at sea. And that is that there really hasn't been a lot of overseas trade between Germany and the rest of the world since the war began. Germany was hemmed in on land, and of course the British had maintained a very close blockade of Germany since the very beginning of the war. And by 1918, the German people are actually starving. We don't know exactly how many Germans died due to starvation or malnutrition during the First World War, but at the very least, it's somewhere in the six digits. Now, the German high command, specifically the Kaiser, orders the German Navy, the German High Seas Fleet, to make one last ditch attempt to break the British naval blockade to try to open trade routes up by sea. The German Navy goes ape. They're not stupid. They know that basically this is an invitation to suicide. Um, the code name for this, or the name that the operation is given, is a death ride. Which, by the way, I think lets you know just how non-nautical the Germans were. If you're talking about battleships and warships going for a ride. But anyway, the German Navy actually mutinies. Now, it has to be noted that Kaiser Wilhelm II was kind of a naval fanboy. Remember, he's the guy who read the Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power on History. He really liked his Navy. He really liked his boats. He's kind of like a little kid in that respect. And when his Navy mutinies, he just can't bring himself to order the mutineers put down. So what happens is that when the Navy stands up against the government and they get by with it, well, then suddenly other groups in Germany start to rise up. In October of 1918, there's a widespread revolution in Germany, including, by the way, socialists and other far left revolutionaries. And this combination of military defeat, famine, and leftist revolution terrifies the German government. So in 1918, the Germans hear of a proposal from Woodrow Wilson. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but they hear about a proposal in which Germany theoretically could end the war without giving up any land or territory. So, revolution, starvation, and military defeat is option one. And to quote the Black Knight from Monty Python, we'll call it a draw is option two. So, complete national destruction or just call the whole thing off. And faced with those two options, the Germans just decided to call the whole thing off. So, in November of 1918, on the 11th day of the 11th month, and on the 11th hour, World War I ends, and the guns fall silent. Except for the United States, because unlike the other European powers who just kind of decided to end the war without fanfare, the United States Army orders its troops to attack until the very last minute for reasons that are to this day not completely well understood, at least not by me. It's one of those America moments in this class, and it's not necessarily like a flattering America moment, because apparently the Germans went out of their way to say, hey, Americana, we're ending the war in like 30 minutes. You might want to, not fight us or something. And of course, the Americans came on, and there was just a lot of needless casualties, at that point. So now let's kind of take a look at everything in retrospect. So to add to the extraordinary casualties of the war. I mean, in World War I, the United States loses something like 48,909 killed. At the same time, though, Spanish flu, which is unfortunately something that we've become much more familiar with the spread of coronavirus or COVID-19, that actually kills more people in the United States and around the world than the war does. Roughly 22 million people die due to Spanish flu. And as far as I know, and I'm sure that probably some of you could tell me or teach me a thing or two about it, but it's not really all that Spanish. As far as we know, it originates in the United States, but I feel like there are still some theories on its precise origin. But as far as we know, what makes Spanish flu so unpredictable is the fact that Spanish flu would tended to spare people who normally got sick. The very young and the very old were usually spared from it. It tended to attack healthy people. And in fact, it actually leads to, a serious military crisis in 1918. The German army was trying to launch its last-minute offensive because, according to its rosters, its records, the Germans were losing just as many troops due to Spanish flu as they were due to enemy fire and enemy action. So just think about all that. World War I was a particularly bad war, and it coincides with this truly unprecedented disease. Again, 22 million people around the world die due to Spanish influenza. Now, that being said, the United States helps the Allied powers, the Entente, win the First World War. But winning a war is just the first problem, the first issue. The trick is winning the peace. And I should also note at this point that World War I ends generally, but there are tons of other associated conflicts that don't end in 1918. For example, the Russian Civil War that we just talked about. It lasts another 4 years, until 1922. Roughly 1.8 million Russians die in World War I, and a further 1.8 to 2 million more Russians die in the First World War. In the Russian Civil War. So, in other words, Russia loses roughly 4 million people or more during the era of the First World War. I would love to tell you that things get better for Russia in the 1940s. They do, right? Right? I guess we'll have to find out. Spoiler, Russia just has a bad 20th century. Uh, we have bad weeks, bad days, bad months, bad years. But if you're Russia, you have good centuries and bad centuries. And the 20th century, especially when we talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall, was a bad century for Russia and the Soviet Union. Anyway, if you compare total American casualties, that's killed, wounded, captured, to those of the other major belligerents, the United States comes out of the First World War looking pretty good. If you have, again, compare, for example, 1.7 million Russians and Germans. So the thing is that the United States comes out unscathed, but the rest of the world doesn't. World War I, again, was this catastrophic event in European history. And it also ends this story, actually. In the 20th century, actually, it's from 1500 until 1918. We can generally characterize that era, that 418-year era, as the rise of Europe, where Europe goes from being this kind of backwater continent to eventually controlling over 80% of the world in some way, shape, or form. It's this extraordinary story. It's horrible, it's uplifting and in equal parts, but you do see Europe rise from nothing to this position of absolute dominance. And in 1914, Europe just I guess you could say, a continent or a civilization, it reaches its peak. And then in just 4 years, that's thrown away. Europe will never again recover from the losses that it takes in the First World War. And as a consequence of the First World War, superficially, you see the expansion of European empire, but it is in some respects it can't make up for the loss of life and treasure during the war itself. So, in other words, we have seen a war in which it looks like um, the majority of Europe's youth, manpower, has been slaughtered for absolutely no reason. Now, remember, in U.S. history, we faced a similar problem in one of our pretty bad wars, the Civil War. But at the very least, we were able to make it worth something. Remember, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln transforms the American Civil War from a question of federalism and states' rights into a question, or really into a crusade, to end slavery. The thing is that there is no Emancipation Proclamation moment for the European powers, for the millions of families who have been, or that have been shattered during the First World War. There's no Emancipation Proclamation. There's nothing in the war itself that somehow makes it all okay or makes it worth something. And with that in mind, the question is, what can the leaders of the victorious allies, specifically Britain, France, and the United States, do to make it all worthwhile? And to answer that, we will need to talk about the Treaty of Versailles next time. See you guys.